All right, why don't we go ahead and get started. Thank you for everybody that's on the line today. This is Erich Zimmermann. I am the Deputy Director and the Director of Transportation here at the National Association of Regional Councils, and I am very pleased that you've joined us for another in our weekly series of webinars and phone calls about what is going on in the legislative scene here in Washington, D.C. Often August is a slower time of year, and that is somewhat true this year, although a little bit more interesting because the Senate has decided to stick around for a lot more of August than usual. But leading up to August, there were certainly some interesting developments up to and right through today that I'm happy to get you caught up on in regards to transportation. As you can tell from the screen, I'm going to go over a few different topic areas today, including the recent discussion draft released by Representative Shuster, the transportation appropriations process and where that stands, the AV START automated vehicle legislation pending in the Senate, and we will have time for questions and answers. I'll remind you now that if you are interested in asking a question, you can do that by either typing a question into the chat box that's on the GoToWebinar dialogue, or you could raise your hand within the dialogue as well, and then you'd be able to speak into the telephone at the Q&A portion. So go ahead and start typing your questions whenever they strike you, if you'd like. So let me start first and primarily, I think, with the Shuster infrastructure plan, or the discussion draft, as he called it. This was, first, a little bit of background. Representative Bill Shuster, I'm sure all of you on the call know, is the current chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He is not only termed out of his time as chairman of the committee, he has also decided, along with that, to retire from Congress, and so is not seeking re-election in the November election. So, as often happens with members that have been freed from the constraints of having to actually go to the voters to ask for their vote, some interesting things come out of such members at times as this, and this is no difference here with the discussion draft we got from his office last week. So before I dive into some of the particulars, I guess there's a few notes about sort of how to think about the proposal that we have in front of us. First, the real focus of the document is how do we solve the short-term highway trust fund solvency challenge that we all know we face, as well as searching for some innovative, potentially, or other ways to solve the long-term highway trust fund solvency that we all know we face. It's really not a reauthorization proposal. It does extend the FAST Act for an additional year, which I'll get into in a little bit. But primarily, it's focused on solvency of the trust fund and some other related issues. There are a few notable policy items that I'll mention that are included, but it really is not a reauthorization proposal in and of itself. So first, let's talk a little bit about how the proposal would solve the short-term highway trust fund insolvency. And this is a proposal that, again, if the chairman were running for re-election into Congress, would certainly not have put forward, especially not just a few months shy of a re-election of the actual election day coming up in November, because he proposes to increase both the fuel tax, the existing gas tax, and the existing diesel tax. The gas tax by 15 cents per gallon, and the diesel tax by 20 cents per gallon, phased in over 3 years. Obviously, this is a long discussed, long debated, long fought over provision, whether or not we're going to increase the gas tax. As everybody on this call is certainly well aware, it has been a non-starter for quite a long time, has not been increased for a quarter century or so. And so, you know, while it's interesting to have the chairman putting his name on a proposal that would do so, the timing of it obviously makes it a little bit more questionable. As well, the proposal would index the rates, the gas tax rates for inflation, so help them increase year over year to keep up with the eroding impact of inflation. And it would also add several new taxes, including a 10% tax on batteries for electric vehicles and bicycle tires, a 4.3 cent per gallon tax on railroad diesel, and would eliminate the exemption for taxation on intercity and transit bus diesel. So the thinking behind this, as has long been touted but supported in different ways, is that everybody that benefits from the federal transportation program should have a role in paying for it. So all told, the fuel tax increases as proposed would total an increase of about $280 billion over the next 10 years, according to the Congressional Budget Office. The tax on batteries would generate about $3.3 billion over 10 years. The bike tire tax would be about $148 million over that same time. They did not estimate the railway diesel tax total, but even with the three items that we know, we'd be looking at about a $284 billion or so increase above and beyond existing collections into the Highway Trust Fund. So really would set us up for solvency over the next 10 years. And then the thinking behind it would be that all of these taxes would expire in 2028, at which point a new tax regime or a new way to collect highway funds into the Highway Trust Fund would replace it. And so that's the second part of the solvency question that the proposal attempts to take a look at. And that's more of the long-term solvency. And so essentially, in short, what the Shuster plan would do would be to create a blue ribbon commission. We've seen some of those in the past to study this issue specifically. The idea being they would conduct a study to identify current and future needs of the program, determine the levels of funding required by the Highway Trust Fund to meet those needs, and then evaluates different revenue sources to achieve the required funding levels. The study would be required to come out by January of 2021, and that would include the study results, at least one recommendation for achieving long-term Highway Trust Fund solvency, and then as well proposed legislation to achieve that recommendation for long-term Highway Trust Fund solvency. The idea being that whatever legislation is proposed could not utilize a federal excise tax on gas or diesel. The bill would also provide fast-track consideration of the proposed legislation, such that the House and the Senate ostensibly would vote on such a package without modifying it, changing it, amending it before it took a vote. And that's ostensibly where the purpose of the one-year extension of the FAST Act comes in order to give this committee the opportunity to complete its work and potentially see a vote in Congress. Representative Shuster would extend the current expiration of the program for one additional year to allow that to occur. As well, the second part of the long-term solvency question would be the development of a pilot that would study the concept of a per-mile user fee. Obviously, this is something that is starting to play out in several states across the country, many states across the country. This would be a federal program, and it would be run by the Secretary of Transportation. It would have participants, or anticipated to have participants, from all 50 states and the District of Columbia, with geographic representation or geographic equity as part of its consideration. The idea would be to test the design, acceptance, implementation, and financial sustainability of a per-mile user fee, to consider a variety of methods to achieve such a program. And it does include some limited funding, $5 million each year, in order to do this pilot study. There's no funding estimate from CBO or from anywhere else that I've seen that estimates how much this would raise. The idea being, if you are a participant in the program, whatever you pay through the per mile user fee would be essentially deposited into the Highway Trust Fund, and then refunded. You get a refund amount of that amount, since you would actually be paying tax on both under the user fee and on the fuel that you purchase throughout the test period. So it would give the federal government an opportunity, obviously, to collect significant data about how this might work. Might be a great way to push this idea forward and at least start to increase the comfortability you know, beyond even what some of the states are doing. And so it is an interesting pilot proposal, I will say that. Again, those are sort of the items that relate to the solvency of the trust fund. And so let me go over then also a few of the notable policy items that are included in Chairman Shuster's proposal. First, it would authorize the build grants, formerly the Tiger grants, for the first time. It would give up to $3 billion each year for 5 years for build grants, and that's obviously a level much higher than even this year's high water mark of $1.5 billion for the program. The funding would be required to be distributed such that 30% of it goes, a minimum of 30% goes to projects in rural areas, and also contains an incentive grant program that of the $15 billion that it authorizes over the 5-year program, that up to $3 billion of that could be used as incentive grants for asset recycling, a concept that we've been hearing about off and on for the last couple of years, whereby a city or a county or a state could take its asset, lease it on a long-term basis to a private concessionaire, recover the funds for, you know, whatever amount the concessionaire agrees to pay, and then the federal government would provide up to 15% of the project's value as an additional grant on top of the amount received from the private concessionaire. So as mentioned, up to $3 billion over the 5-year period could be applied in such a manner. The Shuster proposal also cancels the FAST Act's $7.6 billion rescission of contract authority. It increases funding for a number of accounts that we saw increases for in last year's appropriations bill, and we'll likely see again in this year's appropriations bill, including Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, the Bus and Bus Facilities Program, and Amtrak. Though I will point out that it notably does not increase funding, sort of authorized funding for new starts for the capital improvement grants. And the way that this works, it looks like a 3-year funding amount, but really what he's doing is putting into the authorizing language what the Appropriations Committee has essentially already done. So it really covers 19, 20, and 21. So it kind of authorizes what the appropriators already have done or are planning to do. As well, his proposal would create a set aside for the infra program, the freight program, at $200 million each year for 3 years, but that funding would only be eligible to go to unsuccessful prior year applications. And then in addition, a $500 million per year set aside for 3 years, so $1.5 billion for projects of national significance that can be allocated by Congress in future legislation. So both of these, in some way, and in the second case, kind of explicitly, are really trying to get around the ban on earmarks and find new ways to support, you know, programs and projects that members of Congress would like to see funded. As well, the bill would the proposal would authorize the RIF program through 2021, the Railroad Investment Financing Program. And then there are a number of provisions, as we've heard so much about over the last couple of years, on project delivery. Looks in some cases similar to what the administration itself has proposed, including the one federal decision proposal that requires that a project applicant have essentially one federal point of contact through which they would be applying for a federal decision on a project, and that decision be delivered within a 2-year period. As well, there's a change to the application of categorical exclusions, essentially enabling a CE for a project under one modal administration of DOT to be applied to a project under a different modal administration. In other words, essentially make the CE, the application of CEs available for all transportation projects. I think right now the language restricts it to multimodal projects. And then finally creates a pilot program on the use of innovative practices for environmental reviews. And that would be a pilot program. So the bottom line, in general, I think it's safe to say that there are some things to like. Certainly, the long-term highway trust fund solvency is a vexing problem that until it is solved will continue to haunt the program. It's certainly not a reauthorization proposal, but it's clearly not intended to be that. Really, what it's intended to do is provide funding that would make future authorizations easier. And how the money would be spent under those authorizations would obviously still have to be fought out. It's certainly not outlined in this proposal. The streamlining provisions, I think, are a positive. On the whole, I would say the reaction to this proposal thus far has been muted, if not negative. It's seemingly unpopular with a lot of Republicans because of the tax increase. The Democrats, while there was originally discussion with DeFazio to have this be a bipartisan bipartisan proposal, the DeFazio and the Democrats did not sign on to the proposal for a number of reasons, but the stated reason even for DeFazio was this is not really the right time even for Democrats running for re-election to be talking about increasing taxes either. So, but I suspect there's also some skepticism about going after transit cyclists, and that maybe this is just a little bit too little, too late. So I think we can say with some assurance that the proposal itself is likely DOA. Perhaps it gets a hearing in conference, or rather in committee, though I doubt that, but certainly that would be as far as it would go. But it does raise certainly some interesting issues, tries to come up with solution to some of the more, or at least one of the more vexing problems that we face. So for that, I think it's certainly worthy of some consideration and conversation. So I will keep plowing through. The next two items are not very long, so I know folks might have some questions on this, but we'll come back and do the questions about everything when we get back to it. So I did want to touch briefly on the Senate appropriations bill that did just pass the Senate today. That included the THUD funding in addition to Interior, Environment, Financial Services, and Agriculture. The one amendment of note that I will point out to folks is that was accepted and added to the Senate proposal or the Senate bill is Heller Amendment number 3428. And this amendment adds a section directing the U.S. DOT to report to Congress on its efforts to, quote, engage with local communities, metropolitan planning organizations, and regional transportation commissions on advancing data and intelligent transportation systems technologies and other smart cities solutions. So that is the most applicable. It is fairly directly applicable, though it's really more on DOT to tell Congress what it's been up to in this regard. The Senate appropriations process, I won't belabor this. Hopefully folks were on the call we did on this recently. But the Senate bill is really the result of a 2-year bipartisan budget deal that was enacted in early 2018. As a result, both the House and Senate bills contain $45.3 billion in contract authority, which is the full FAST Act level. And interestingly, under maybe the more interesting is under just the discretionary program, there are some differences between the two proposals. Most importantly, looking at what each does for the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. Last year, the final bill added added $1.9 billion in additional funding for STBGP. This year, the Senate would add $2.4 billion additional to STBGP, so a significant increase even over last year. But really, we're focused on the House in this case, which would add $3.8 billion, so doubling last year's amount. So whatever you got last year for STBGP under the appropriations bill, you would get double that amount for next year. The Senate bill would also, in addition to the $2.4 billion for STBGP, would set aside $800 million for highway bridge repair program in areas with populations of 200,000 or less. And so for any more on the Senate appropriations bill, I would point you to the Lock Coalition letter that you can find on the NARC website. We sent that up to leadership and staff last week, and so you can get a view there of the Lock Coalition, how the local and regional organizations talked about this bill. And finally, I'll say quickly about the AV start, which is really a story told through the FAA bill. I'm sure most of you have heard by now. There's been discussion of including the AV start, the automated vehicle bill in the Senate, to the FAA bill, which is potentially ready to move, it seems. It's been kind of fits and starts. Senator McConnell, Leader McConnell, has filed for cloture on the underlying FAA bill at this point, so it actually could be brought up at any time. But the Senate worked on a number of other priorities this week, and is actually, though they're around for most of August, are going out for 1 week next week. So starting when they close business ostensibly tomorrow, or I'm sorry, on Friday, they'll be gone for a week. So it's unclear if there's going to be if the FAA bill is going to go this week. It may have to wait until they get back. And one of the items that certainly needs to be clarified before Leader McConnell will be willing to bring it up is whether the AV start bill is going to be added on to the FAA bill. A few of the things that are happening behind the scenes on this, the longstanding issue or issues have really been about preemption of local and state authority on how to regulate automated vehicles as they are implemented. And that has been a particular concern for a couple of senators who have holds on the bill as well. There's some safety concerns about what it means overall for safety, which has resulted in some holds as well. And then there's some behind the scenes wrangling by the lawyer lobby, basically basically indicating that they want some language about arbitration clauses to be inserted, which I think, from what I've read, greatly complicates the situation by potentially bringing in other committees of jurisdiction on that issue. So it kind of remains to be seen whether whether AV Start is going to move, whether the senators that are currently holding the bill are going to release that hold. It's something we're certainly keeping an eye on. A lot of the other local groups are doing so, and we'll continue to keep you updated on that issue. So with that, I will call it good on my end, and I'm happy to answer questions that folks have.
All right, so just to remind everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, you can either type it in the questions box or raise your hand in the attendees drop down. And I'll unmute your microphone. And we have one first question. How were Tiger/Build grants authorized in the past?
So since they were created, they have always just been a creation of the Appropriations Committee, and continue to this day to only be a creation of the Appropriations Committee. So they're appropriated outside of the authorizing legislation.
And the second question we have, if the Shuster discussion draft were to get a hearing, when might that happen?
Oh, I have not seen or heard anything in that regard. I mean, it would have to be, you'd have to guess it would go after the election. If you did it before the election, you would guarantee folks would just beat on it mercilessly because of the gas tax increase. So I don't even know if you'd get a productive conversation out of it. And then after the election, I'm not sure you'd get a whole lot of people paying attention. But I would venture to guess you'd have to wait until after the election. But I am being honest when I say I've not heard discussion of when that might happen or not.
And our third question, what level will the FAST Act be funded if extended for a year?
That's a good question. I think it would be at the previous year's level, but I can look into that and verify that. I'm not 100% sure on that.
And we'll just wait one more minute for any last questions. That's all I have right now.
All right. Well, as folks are typing in, I will make a couple of housekeeping notes, and that is that next week's call is going to focus on the President's plans to reorganize the executive branch. and we'll focus particularly on CDBG in that regard. And we certainly here internally welcome your thoughts and ideas about these briefings. I think this is the 4th or 5th one that we've done, and I know at least one more planned. And we'd love for you to send your comments or thoughts on that to Neil Bomberg, and his email is neil, N-E-I-L, @narc.org.
We just had one more question come in. Where can we find information on what is contained in the THUD budget as approved by the Senate?
So you can go to congress.gov. We'll have the bill up. It's not up quite yet, they have to put the full package together with all the amendments and whatnot. So that's a good place to start. If folks have a specific question about a specific provision or I can help out in any way, please drop me an email. My address is on the screen, Erich@narc.org, and I'm happy to point you in some directions as well.
And it looks like we have another question from Rick Guerrero. Rick, I'm unmuting your microphone right now. You should be able to.
I wanted to know if there was a larger emphasis on loans in the Shuster bill as part of the innovative finance projects.
I don't. I'm trying to remember quickly. I think the short answer is I don't think there's. I'm sorry. I'm trying to dig through my notes real quick. Which program was it you were referring to? The innovative finance?
Yeah, Title III Innovative Project Finance.
I don't. Let's see.
The Section 303 Federal Capital Revolving Fund.
Yeah, so the Capital Revolving Funds program, the reason I didn't mention it is that is really more for federal capital acquisitions. So if the federal government is buying a building, for example, it creates a fund from which they can draw and then pay back from appropriations over time, so as not to make such a large one-year appropriations hit. So I don't think that's particularly applicable to transportation projects. I think the first part of that section, which gets at RIF, is a little more transportation related, and that is loan based. But I don't think that for surface transportation, for highways and bridges or projects along those lines, that program would be applicable.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
We have another question. Do you expect the fiscal year 19 round of build grants, NOFO, to change substantially from the last round?
I know that one of the bills, and I don't remember which one offhand, actually changes some of the requirements, and I think maybe goes back to a previous year. I will, whoever is asking that question, drop me an email and I'll go dig that out. So it's possible that Congress is actually going to force them to change the NOFO to some extent. If I think left to their own devices, I would venture to say no, it won't change that much. So we're going to have to watch that provision and see if whichever chamber put it in. I think it was potentially the Senate had some change. What that will mean if it's accepted by the House. So.
Please repeat the amendment number you mentioned earlier, number 34.
Sure. Hold on one second. I bring my notes back up. The amendment number is 3428, and it was by Dean Heller, Senator Heller.
And then the Shuster draft would renew the infra freight program, but would only allow previously unsuccessful applications to be eligible. Is that a correct understanding of the Shuster draft? In addition, does infra expire after a certain amount of time in the draft, the way that it currently does in the FAST Act?
So I'm sorry if I was caused confusion there. The $200 million I mentioned for infra would be an additional set aside on top of infra funding. So in the infra grant program essentially would continue to operate as it is now. This would be an additional set aside that would allow for the funding of projects that had previously been denied. So, sorry to cause confusion, the infra program for the most part would continue to operate as it is, except with this additional spending. And as far as the expiration, right now it expires at the end of the authorization bill, at the end of the FAST Act. That would not change per the, it would get the same 1-year extension that the rest of the bill receives, so it would expire a year later.
That looks like all the questions we have right now.
All right. Well, I certainly thank folks for getting on today. And if you have any questions that come up going forward, obviously feel free to reach out to my email address, and I'm happy to provide feedback at any point. And if folks have thoughts or are hearing anything about this, I'd be happy to chat about that as well. So feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we will see you all for the next call next Wednesday. Thanks so much for joining.